officially live.
All right, we'll still say good morning on the official live now that we're officially on. Daf Yomi for a week is sponsored once again by Rabbi Aaron and Evelyn Kaslasi in honor of the engagement of their daughter Ilana to Joey. I hope I pronounce his Brescian from Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Mm-hmm. Baruch Hashem, big simcha. Big simcha. And Daf Yomi for the week is also sponsored by Rabbi Yehuda Greenwood. B'schus refuah shlema for Mercedes Bas Miriam. And Daf Yomi for the week is sponsored by the Kahal Yereim Daf Yomi crew. B'schus refuah shlema for Bela Yentel Bas Chaya Rachel. We are on the top of Yud Daled Amud Beis. Sort of stopped in the middle of the back and forth that was going on. That was where we were taking a look at something that's written in one pasuk, and what does this side learn from it? What does this side learn from it? So the last comment that we had was that there was a word achoso that was written extra by the kares punishments, and we said, well, what's that for? And we said because we were going to be able to indicate that each of the individual arayos, each of the individual prohibited relationships, each was chayav their own korban. So now the idach. We're at the very top, second line now. So the answer there is that it's unnecessary according to the other side. And the other side says that the reason why that extra la'achoso is there in order to tell me that there are separate prohibitions, separate kares prohibitions, meaning two separate korbanos. If somebody was going to make the anointing oil and was going to use that replica anointing oil, that he'd be liable. Ve'idach savar Rabbi Elazar Amar Rabbi Yoshaya, and the other one doesn't need the pasuk for that because he holds like Rabbi Elazar in the name of Rabbi Yoshaya. Damar Rabbi Elazar Amar Rabbi Yoshaya. Kol makom shata motzi shnei lavim v'kares echad chalukim hin lekorban. Whenever you see two prohibitions and the punishment of kares listed once, you automatically know that that is going to mean that there's going to be a separate kares penalty for each of those two averos. So there's no necessity of an extra pasuk there.
But kares is kares. You cut off means you cut off. Is there really a difference?
Two korbanos, right? If you do a b'shogeg, you do two korbanos, right? That's going to be, it's a good point, right? Yes, I always have to remind myself of that one. So now, v'ibois ema, or, okay, that's great if you happen to hold like Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Yoshaya, but ema lo savar look Rabbi Elazar. You don't want to limit the opinion and say that he definitely agrees with Rabbi Elazar, so maybe he doesn't. V'nafgalei, and there's another source for this idea that you can potentially be separating out this making the anointing oil and using the anointing oil is me ve'isha sher yishkaf es isha dava. From the fact that it says that a man who has a relations with a woman who is a nida. And that is an unnecessary phrase. And so we're going to apply the concept of im eno inyan. Im eno inyan means that if the phrase is unnecessary for the location that it is, we're going to apply that to a completely to a semi-related piece, and that is that since it's not necessary to teach me that you get a separate kares avera in that circumstance, separate kares punishment in that circumstance, I'm going to apply it to another circumstance where I'm going to need a separate kares penalty, and that's why we're going to apply it to the other place. Now we're back to the first guy, the idach. So what does he do with that pasuk? Hahumi boy leilik the Rabbi Yochanan. He's going to use that pasuk like Rabbi Yochanan says. Damar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says Mishum Shimon Yochai in the name of Rabbi Shimon Yochai. Minayin she'ena isha tamea ad sheyatza midava derech ervasa. How do we know that a woman is not a nida unless she has menstrual blood that comes out in the normal way? Like let's say, for example, she has surgery and blood comes out in that fashion. Is she a nida? No, she's not. How do we know? Because the pasuk says, "Shenemar v'isha sher yishkav es isha dava v'gila es ervasa." The relationship in the pasuk is to revealing her covered parts to the becoming of tameh in a nida. It says that a woman's only nida if the blood comes out in its normal way, not if the blood is coming out in a different way. And that's what we learned from this pasuk. So it has nothing to do with giving me an extra pasuk to teach me about the prohibitions of kares. So, and that's what this pasuk tells me, that she's only tamea if the blood comes out in the normal way. Okay, concludes yesterday's or Thursday's conversation. I know it was like we sort of flipped in the middle. And if I had gone back over the whole conversation, that could have taken 15, 20 minutes extra. So you have to review the tape. And if you go last tape and then you add this tape on, it'll make perfect sense, like I was continuing right on. But we're going to move into the next back and forth. Okay, so new back and forth. V'tamei she'achal es hakodesh. The Mishnah says the next case is, let's say somebody is tamei and he eats sacrificial foods, so then he is going to get malchus for that avera. Okay, so now we're going to go back and forth between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan now. And we're going to disagree back and forth with their sources are. some practical differences lahalacha that are going to come out from the way they interpret the psukim, and also how they read and interpret various psukim. So that's what's going to happen all through Yudal and Beis into Tasvav Amud Aleph. Go back and forth on Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. So get ready for that. There's a great note in the bottom of the article summary at the end. So if you get to the end and you go, what in the world did we just read? There's a good summary.
At the end of Yudal?
I want to say it's notes. There it is.
Oh, yeah.
It's a great summary note of this Gemara.
14b5.
14b5, you're going to see that note is a great summary of the outcome of this whole Gemara. So let's go through it. Okay. Bishlama habola mikdash tameh ksiv onesh ksiv azhara. Okay, everybody is going to agree. Somebody who is tameh, who walks into the Beis HaMikdash, we understand there's a lo saseh, can't walk into the Beis HaMikdash when you're tameh, and also we understand the punishment, kares, for doing so. And you're going to get Makkos as well. Right? Dichsiv, where is that pasuk? As Mishkan Hashem Timei, he has made the Mishkan of Hashem Tamei, Venichrisa, and therefore he should get cut off. That's the punishment. And the Azhara is Velo Yitamu as Machanehem. You should not make the camps impure. Okay, so we've got a prohibition, we've got an onish. That's very straightforward. Tamish achas hakodesh. What about the case in our Mishnah, where somebody who is tameh who eats hektish, right? Difference is somebody who is tameh goes to a place that's kodesh, or somebody who is tameh eats kodesh. The one who goes into a place that's kodesh, the psukim are clear.
What did you be chayav if you eat that?
Well, that's what our Mishnah says. Now we're looking for sources. Okay, when you look for sources, you get complicated gemaras. So here's the sources. Okay, bishlama onesh. Okay. As far as the punishment for such a crime, ksiv, the pasuk says, "V'nefesh asher tochel basar mizevach hashlamim asher laHashem." Somebody who eats the meat, it's very clear, from a korban shlamim that belongs to Hashem, v'tumaso alav, and he is tummy when he does that, v'nichrasa, he's going to get kares. Okay, very nice, very clear. El azhara minayin. But where is the lo saseh for such a prohibition? So Reish Lakish Amar, Reish Lakish is going to say from the pasuk, B'cho kodesh lo siga. You shall not touch anything that's kodesh. Now it's interesting because you're using the word, pointed out from Reish Lakish, you're using the word lo siga, you shall not touch. But we're going to apply, Reish Lakish is going to say momentarily, just to be able to preview it, that when Reish Lakish is learning the pasuk, lo siga means do not eat, not do not touch, right? Because there's no kares penalty for touching. How do we know? Because last pasuk said that you're going to get the kares penalty for eating it, not for touching it. And why does that make sense? Because if the Torah was going to prohibit both touching and eating, it only needed to prohibit touching, because you can't eat it without touching it. So therefore, all you would have to, the fact that the Torah says you get kares for eating it means there's no kares for touching it. So now the lo saseh though says, all things that are kodesh you shall not touch, and therefore that's where the prohibition comes from. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, Tani Bardala, that he learned that Bardala had said, Asya tumaso tumaso. He has a gzera shava from the two circumstances. Gzera shava, it says the word tuma. Ksiv hacha vetumaso alav venichrisa uksiv hasam tameh yiyeh o tumaso bo. So he says to talk about somebody who is tameh who comes into the Beis HaMikdash and somebody who is tameh who eats kodesh. Both write the word tumaso. So malahalan onesh ve'azhara. Just like when it comes to a person who is tameh who walks into the Beis HaMikdash, we already know that there's a lo saseh and the punishment. So too, despite the fact that the pasuk doesn't clearly state it, we are going to learn out that there is also a lo saseh and a punishment, as though there was a lo saseh and a punishment written in the psukim for somebody who is tameh who eats kodesh. Afkan onesh v'azhara. Okay, so bishlama reish lakish lomer. Now we got to figure out. They both learned it from two different sources. So now the process, next step of the process is, why does Reish Lakish not like Rabbi Yochanan's way? And why does Rabbi Yochanan not like Reish Lakish's way? So it's easy to understand why Reish Lakish doesn't like Rabbi Yochanan's way, because Gzera Shava lo Gemir. A Gzera Shava is a tradition from your teacher, which is very interesting, because who is Reish Lakish's teacher? Rabbi Yochanan. So it's I'm a little bit confused by Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish doesn't have the Gzera Shava that Rabbi Yochanan has when Rabbi Yochanan was his teacher. So I'm not exact, don't ask me that question. I'm not exactly sure the answer to that. But somehow, right? Am I right? It's a good question, Ellie, right? Reish Lakish, somehow, he doesn't have the Gzera Shava, and that Rabbi Yochanan has, and therefore, right? So I understand Reish Lakish doesn't agree with Rabbi Yochanan's perspective. Ela Rabbi Yochanan, my time lo amar Reish Lakish. But why is it that Rabbi Yochanan does not agree with Reish Lakish's perspective? The pasuk says B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga. That's a pasuk. Why doesn't he learn it from there? Why does he need a Gzera Shava? So Amar La Chahu Azhara Letruma. He says I already used that pasuk for something else. That Azhara, that prohibition, is the prohibition against somebody who is tamei eating truma. That's what that pasuk's for. So Reish Lakish Azhara Letruma Minole. So okay. So now Reish Lakish needs a source for that. So he says. Somebody who is touching truma, prohibition against touching truma. I think that's what that pasuk is. So Reish Lakish is harla truma minole. Where does Reish Lakish learn the prohibition of touching truma? Nafgalei. He learns it from ish mizera aron. Any person, and it says ish double to tell me that whatever prohibition is in this pasuk is talking about something that men do, women do, children do. Okay, so vehu tsaru ozav, and he has tsaras. Or he's a zav, so he's tameh, so you can't eat kodesh. Well, what's the kodesh? That applies to men, women, children. Women don't do korbanos. Children, now they could eat the korbanos, but they don't make the korbanos. So, ezehu davar shava bizarro shel Aaron. What is the holy item that could be in this pasuk talking about that applies to all of the family of Aaron? Haviomer is truma. It's talking about truma. So this pasuk, when he uses the word kodesh, is talking about truma. So therefore, this pasuk is telling me prohibition against coming in contact with truma. So now, what is Rabbi Yochanan going to do? Rabbi Yochanan now has two psukim. One talks about both talking about truma. So he says, Rabbi Yochanan says, yeah, I need two psukim. Why? Vida chahu la'achila v'hal v'negia. So Rabbi Yochanan says, because I got two prohibitions. Prohibition number one, I can't touch truma. Prohibition number two, can't eat truma. So while you're tummy, right? So that is where there are two prohibitions. Now, for Reish Lakish, how about him? Doesn't he have two prohibitions? He need the two prohibitions also? Hi, bechol kodesh lo siga. So, but the answer is Reish Lakish. It's not clear, but it seems to be that Reish Lakish doesn't have the prohibition against touching truma while he's tummy. Right? In the summary note, that's like the last item there, is it's not clear. It doesn't specify in the Gemara what exactly Reish Lakish holds on that point. So the fact that the Gemara doesn't ask what does Reish Lakish hold of that is it seems like Reish Lakish doesn't need a pasuk for that because he doesn't hold that prohibition exists.
I don't know if I'm missing something, but when you separate truma out, you can't touch it after?
No. When a Kohen who's tameh, he can't touch the truma and make it tameh.
Right.
If he's tahor, you separate it out.
Because they
eat it,
ish
no problem.
Before. We had
right. So that means that Ish only tells me what kind of kodesh we're talking about here. So that means that anybody in the Kohen's family who wants to touch truma had better be tahor first.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Reish Lakish, B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga. The problem that we're going to have with Reish Lakish is that you just told me B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga is telling me about the prohibition regarding tuma and truma. So then he uses that pasuk for something else, though. You can't reuse psukim. So what happens? Is that what he learns this pasuk for? He uses that pasuk to tell me the prohibition against somebody who's tameh who comes to touch hektish. Right? Remember before we said the prohibition was somebody who's tameh comes to eat kodesh. Right now we're talking about an additional prohibition against somebody who's tameh who comes to touch kodesh. De itmar, because we had learned as follows. Tameh shenaga b'kodesh. Let's say somebody who's tameh who comes to touch hektish. Reish Lakish Omer Loka. Reish Lakish says you get Makkos for that. Rabbi Yochanan Omer Eino Loka. Rabbi Yochanan's not going to need a pasuk for that because Rabbi Yochanan does not agree. The only prohibition, the only losas that you're going to get Makkos for is for eating it. If it comes somebody who's tameh who touches kodesh does not get Makkos. Losas say it's a prohibited thing because the pasuk is actually phrased in a positive way that you have to guard and protect the hektish in order to be able to make sure that it doesn't become invalidated. You will invalidate the sacrifice as well, but you can eat it afterwards. But it's not a Makkos avera. So Reish Lakish Amar Loka, where's Reish Lakish's source for why you're going to get the Makkos? B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga. Right? Because pasuk says B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga. Hey, we already used that pasuk. Now we have a problem. Reish Lakish is using this pasuk twice. And Rabbi Yochanan Omer Ein Loka, and Rabbi Yochanan says, I don't give you Makkos for that. Why? Because I already used that pasuk. Ahu asara the truma hu da'asa. That's already the prohibition that we talked about truma. That I already used that, so I can't reuse it. So he doesn't have that prohibition. But how does Reish Lakish use it twice? So Tamei shenaga b'kodesh mida'afki rachmana b'lashon negia. So azhara. No, I'm sorry, b'lashon negia. He says because the prohibition of tamei, of touching tuma, even though it says the pasuk talked about eating tuma, we said eating tuma, we said it was b'chol kodesh lo siga, even we said that referred to eating of truma, but it uses the word touching. So the fact that it uses the word touching to mean eating tells me there's also a prohibition against touching as well. Iskus kodesh lemikdash. So, but as far as the kares is concerned, there we're going to compare the prohibition of touching kodesh to the prohibition of walking into the Beis Hamikdash. Just like when you walk into the Beis Hamikdash, somebody gets kares when he walks into the Beis Hamikdash. So too, somebody who eats the truma is going to get kares, but not somebody who touches it. But nevertheless, there's going to still be a lo saseh. So that's how Reish Lakish learns this, because he's going to say basically this pasuk does teach me two things. First of all, it teaches me not to eat it. Number two, it could teach me not to, but also the fact that you can't touch truma. I can learn both of those things because it uses the word lo sigad, don't touch. Still, Reish Lakish uses it for a different thing altogether. And he's going to learn another thing out from the same pasuk. V'akasi lahachik hu da'asa. Is that still what this pasuk is for? Ahumi baile l'tamei sha'achol basar kodesh lifnei zrikas damim. There's when we get to Meseches Zvachim, we're going to learn about the various phases of korban service. We're going to learn that you have to do shchita, you slaughter the animal, kabbalah, you catch the blood, then you do halacha, you carry the blood to the mizbeach, and then you're going to do zrika, you're going to sprinkle the blood. The korban is considered effective at the moment in which the blood is sprinkled. Before that, it's not an effective korban. So if something bad happens to the sacrifice before the blood is sprinkled, so then the korban might have to be redone. It's not critical that the korban actually has to be eaten, other than korban pesach. Most korbanos don't have to be eaten. It's the sprinkling of the blood which is critical.
Does the be eaten as well?
It can be eaten, yes, but let's say the meat gets invalidated after the sprinkling of the blood and nobody eats it. Like in last week's parsha. Right, where Aaron does not eat the korban chatos for Rosh Chodesh, and Moshe says, "What's going on?" And Aaron explains to him because it's not special Yemei Miluim korban, and so therefore this is okay. He didn't eat it, but the korban is valid because the sprinkling of the blood was valid. So therefore, eating is not ma'akiv. Eating is not the critical part. So therefore, it's the sprinkling of the blood that is.
It's like the Pesach is this for the
korban Pesach is going to be the exception, right? Korban Pesach, the pasuk specifically says everybody has to eat from the korban Pesach, right? Normally speaking, most korbanos eating from the korban is not critical, right?
But it says you become tummy.
So this pasuk is telling me now. Let's say somebody is tamei. So if he eats, now, once you've got a valid korban, right, we understand if you're tamei, you eat from a korban, you're liable. That's what liable kares. That's what we've been learning. But what happens if the person eats the meat before the sprinkling of the blood? Before the sprinkling of the blood, it's not a valid korban yet. So then are you chayiv kares for eating the meat before the sprinkling of the blood?
I would say yes. Because you're doing it before it's a sacrifice.
Right, but it's worse once it's a sacrifice. Once it's a sacrifice, then it becomes kodesh. Then you can't eat it while you're tamei.
Well, what if you eat it and finding it afterwards that wasn't good enough? The blood wasn't good enough.
If you ate it all, then you bring korban chatos. These are all like you're not going to get kares for something you do unintentionally, right? So this is the case. He's going to use this pasuk mibayle l'tamei, a person who's tamei she'acho basar kodesh, who eats sacrificial meats lifnei zrikas damim, before the blood was sprinkled.
Right.
So now de'itmar, because we learned as follows. Here's the back and forth on that part. Tamei she'achol basar. Let's say somebody is tamei and he eats meat kodesh that is holy lifnei zrikas damim, before the blood is sprinkled. Reish Lakish says loka, you're going to get Makkos for that. And we're going to see that he's going to use the source as the familiar pasuk that he keeps using over and over and over again, and that's going to create our problem.
I didn't understand. Hektish is when you separate it.
No.
Separate. Like when I thought hektish was when if I
basar kodesh, not basar hektish. Basar kodesh. Basar kodesh is meat that is already a sacrifice. When I designate something to become a sacrifice, it's meat that becomes a sacrifice at some point. It's still a living cow. It's not a sacrifice yet, right? Then I slaughter it. Then I catch the blood. Then I go to mizbeach. Then I sprinkle it. Now it becomes sacrificial meat.
Right.
Now there are rules to
so
sacrificial meat.
If I don't,
can't leave Yerushalayim. I have to.
If I don't do
eat
zrikas
it while
damim,
I'm
you're
kodesh.
saying we didn't complete the process of making it.
That's what I'm saying.
Then right, they could eat.
But before you put on sacrifice, don't you have to check if there's any defects before you slaughter?
Absolutely, yeah. You have to check everything. We'll get all of those rules and details in Meseches Chulin, right? You know, in every detail about you'll be able to. Maybe we've never slaughtered animals at the end of Meseches Chulin, but we'll see. Who knows? With Kahal Yereim, we could do anything.
Oh yeah.
We'll get the Kahal Yereim brand on the side of the animal. Now, Rabbi Yochanan says Eino Loka. It's not a korban yet, so you can't get Makkos for eating that meat before the blood is sprinkled. Reish Lakish Omer Loke. Reish Lakish says, sure you do. There's a losa say. Where's the losa say? Bechol Kodesh lo siga. Same pasuk. 1 second, Reish Lakish. How many times are you going to use the same pasuk? So the answer, Loshna Lifnei Zrika Loshna Lachar, it makes no difference. Any Kodesh, anything that's Kodesh, you get this losa say, and you're going to get Malchus for it. It doesn't matter whether it's before the sprinkle of the blood or after. So Rabbi Yochanan Merino Loka. Rabbi Yochanan says there's no Malchus. Rabbi Yochanan Latame. Rabbi Yochanan's going according to his reason, because Damar Kral the pasuk says tumaso. The way that he knows that you're going to have a lo sase when it comes to eating kodesh when you're tamei is that he learned it from Gzera Shava from coming into the Beis Hamikdash when you're tamei. V'chiksiv tumaso la'achar zrika hu dichsiv. And as far as it's really not part of that Gzera Shava so much, but the pasuk that talks about the prohibition against and get where you get your kares from eating something that is tamei, that is a korban, is from the context of the psukim. It's clear that it's after the blood was sprinkled. Why? Because the pasuk before says, "You shall sprinkle the blood, and then you shall eat the korban." Next pasuk, and if you are tamei and you eat the korban, you will get kares. Well, that means that we're talking about the same korban, the one that you already threw the blood. And now you move forward into the process. If you're tamei, then it's going to be a problem. So therefore, I need that. That's how Reish Lakish takes. That's how Rabbi Yochanan looks at this. There's no prohibition against eating it while you are tamei if it's before zrika. Now it could be something that you're not allowed to do again, but it's not a malchus prohibition. V'chiksiv tumaso, when it says tumaso, that when he becomes tamei, that's liachar zrika hu dipsiv. That is talking about after. Excuse me. Already after you already sprinkled the blood. So hahi mi becho. So the answer is Reish Lakish is learning it from a different element of the pasuk. Hahi mi becho kodesh nafka. Reish Lakish's point is from the fact it says all kodesh. That's an extra word. Why all kodesh things that you get a punishment for? The answer is things that you might have presumed not to have been a malchus penalty because they wouldn't have fit in because they're not a korban, fully validated korban yet. Nevertheless, it says the word kol to include the meat before the sprinkling of the blood. And that's how Reish Lakish is going to use this word bekol. So he uses the word bekol, kodesh, then he uses kol kodesh lo siga, and then he uses the pasuk itself. So he uses the same pasuk 3 different ways, but it's 3 different parts of the pasuk. That's how he's doing it.
Interesting.
Tanya kavasa de Reish Lakish. Now, Reish Lakish has got a brisa. Maybe that's why Reish Lakish can avoid following his Rabbi Yochanan if he was skipping a generation and went right back to a brisa as the source for his drushos.
On his Rabbi?
Sorry?
Wouldn't it be like a chutzpah towards his Rabbi?
We will see a Gemara in a long time where Reish Lakish, where Rabbi Yochanan clearly appreciates Reish Lakish's pushback. Right? Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, huh? Yes.
What is it?
They became contemporaries rather than just teacher and students. So bechol kodesh lo siga, pasuk says all kodesh things you shall not touch. That's azhara la'ochel. That is tells me that there's a prohibition to somebody who eats, as we said, that's how Reish Lakish starts it. Prohibition to somebody who eats something that is kodesh while he's tamei. To omer azhara la'ochel, you say it's a prohibition against somebody who eats it. Oh, eino ela azhara la'nogeo, or maybe it's also a prohibition to somebody who touches it. Tamid lo bechol kodesh lo siga. Vel amigdash says you should not. Anything that is kodesh you shall not touch, and you shall not come to the Beis Hamikdash. Makish kodesh lemikdash. We are comparing the kodesh to the eating the kodesh to the coming to the Beis Hamikdash. Ma mikdash davar sheyesh bo netilas neshama. Just like when it comes to the prohibition of the Beis Hamikdash only applies when there's a kares penalty, and the kares penalty comes when you walk into the Beis Hamikdash. Af kol davar sheyesh bo netilas neshama. So too, the prohibition of dealing with kodesh while you're tamei only applies to those things where you are going to get a kares penalty. And we said the kares penalty by kodesh only applies to eating the sacrificial meats while you're tamei, not just touching it. Ve'i benegia, and if you're just touching it, so then is somebody going to get kares? Elabachi, that only applies to eating. And therefore, Reish Lakish says, the part of the pasuk that talks about touching is telling me the prohibition against touching truma, and that's where the prohibition of touching truma comes from. And then he learns also, Bechol tells me that there's a prohibition against eating the meat even before Zrika. Okay, that's how he learns it. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana said in Rabbi Yochanan, Call losase shekadmu ase, new idea. So if you want to go through and read all the Reish Lakish back and forth things, like I said, that note is very useful and helpful. Still will make you dizzy. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana. Rabbi Bar Chana says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Call losase shekadmu ase. Anytime you have a losase where there's a prohibition in the Torah, but there's a positive commandment before it. So then, Lokinov, you still get Makkos for that. We're going to give some examples of how that might work. But Tesvav, we're on 15a.
So we said the opposite.
The opposite is not true.
Right.
The opposite. If I have a los ase first, and then I have an asek, that ase afterwards, we call that a lav hanitik la ase.
Right.
That is a prohibition where there's a positive commandment afterwards. That we said there's no Makkos. He says the reverse, though, is not true. If I have the positive commandment first, because essentially the positive commandment is not connected essentially to the los ase, because the positive commandment exists whether I do the prohibition or I don't do the prohibition. Okay, we're going to give examples in a moment to be able to understand what the case might be, what that is, right? But since the positive commandment exists, regardless of whether I do the negative commandment, those two things are not connected. Therefore, I can still get the penalty, the Makkos, for the los ase.
Right. You also said, isn't Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan's
Students.
No,
and
it's also
contemporary.
son-in-law, right? Isn't it?
He is his brother-in-law.
marry him?
Rabbi Yochanan's sister.
Right. That's it. That's
Right.
Okay, fine.
Yes, his brother-in-law. Okay, imagine these Pesach Seders, they came together. Okay. Amrulo, they said to him, Amart. So they went back to Rabbi Yochanan and they said to him, "Did you say this?" Right. This is Rabbi Bar Chana said this in Rabbi Yochanan. They went to Rabbi Yochanan and said, "Rabbi Bar Chana says you said this," and they said, "Did you say this?" Amar Lu, he told them, "Lo, I did not say that." So Amar Rabba, so Rabba now has to defend himself. Elokim, Amra, I promise you, he did say it. Uksiva, not only did he say it, Ksiva, it's written in a pasuk. Vitanina, it's also in a Mishnah. So therefore, not only did Rabbi Yochanan say it, but I can prove what he says is actually true. So let's talk about the proofs. Ksiva, the pasuk says, "Vayishlechu min hamachaneh velo yetam'u machanehem." Pasuk says somebody who is tameh has to get sent out of the camps, and he shall not make the camps impure. You see, the positive commandment is to leave the camp. It doesn't start with, if you make the camp impure, then you must leave.
Right.
It's you have to leave regardless. So therefore, if you are in the base Hamikdash area and you become tameh, then leave right away. And you have not violated any los ases, right? That's the positive commandment either way. However, if you violate, therefore, because of that, if you violate that and you go and you ignore leaving and you you do the los ase of impurifying the being impure in an area where you're not allowed to be impure, you get Makkos, and that's what the pasuk says. Tanina, we are in the Mishnah. Habal mikdash tameh, somebody who comes to the base of Mikdash when he's tameh, it's written right in the Mishnah, right? It's going to get Makkos. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan is clearly the original statement Rabbi Yochanan made was correct. So then why did Rabbi Yochanan claim he never said it? He retracted his statement. Why? Mishum de Kashile was he came upon a difficulty, and that is the case of a rape case. Right? The Torah tells us a positive commandment and then a negative commandment, and it seems like the positive commandment comes before the negative commandment, and nevertheless, we're going to have a problem of establishing Malkus, and he didn't know how to answer it, so he withdrew his position. Tanya, we learned in a brisa. Ones, somebody who rapes a woman is supposed, the Torah gives a positive commandment, he should marry her, and he has to stay with her forever, right? He has to stay married to her. Okay?
He has ones. Ones is also somebody who didn't kill somebody.
Yes.
That's
why you have to be able to prepare your Daf Yomi in advance.
Right.
Because if your Daf Yomi Maggid Shiur is not prepared in advance, he could confuse everybody. Right? So this is the Ones Shagirish, right? This fellow, he rapes a woman, and then he marries her, because that's what the Torah says, positive command to do that, and then he divorces her. Not allowed to do that. So what happens? Im Yisraelhu, if he's a regular Jewish fellow, machzir ve'eno loka, then he's got to marry her again, and there's no malchus, right? Now, one second.
If he marries her again and gives her again, does it get malchus?
Well, he's not going. Again, that's the problem. This seems to imply there's no malchus for this lo sase, and that's where Rabbi Yochanan got stuck. Why is there no malchus for this lo sase? The lo sase is not a lavanitik la'ase, because the requirement to marry her happens before the prohibition of divorcing her. Right? Marry her. That's the positive commandment. You have to marry her it's not connected to the fact that you violated the prohibition of divorcing her. You have to marry her. Nevertheless, there's according to our Mishnah, there should be Makkos for that, and there isn't. So what's going on here? Im Kohen, but by the way, if he's a Kohen, then Uloka, then he's going to get Makkos. Right. Makkos because ve'ino machzer, he cannot remarry his grusha. So therefore, it's stuck. Then he's stuck. He can never remarry her. In which case, he's violated the prohibition, and he can't fix it. So therefore, he gets Makkos. So now, let's go back to this part. Im Yisrael hu machzir ve'ino loka. If he's a regular Jewish person, he just marries her and he doesn't get Makkos. So amai, why should that be? Lo saseh shekadmu asehu. This is the lo saseh, right? This is with the positive command before it. Velilki. And according to the rule, he should get Makkos for that. So Amar Ula says, Lo yomar lo tiye leisha be'ones. So he says, let's... the answer is there's really an extra pasuk here that tells us that this is a different type of a drasha. Maybe that's what's going on here. Because the pasuk says, Lo tia leisha, he has to marry this woman. That pasuk is written by the case of ones. Veligmar b'mutzi shemra, I don't need that pasuk. It's extra. Why? Because the pasuk, I can learn that somebody who rapes a woman has to stay married to her from the fact that somebody who commits the aver of motzi shemra also has to stay married to the wife, right? Case of Motzi Shemra is where he marries the woman, claims that she was never a Basula, and when he married her, and now he makes this public declaration, turns out he lied, he has to pay a fine to the father, and he's not allowed to divorce his wife.
And if he can't afford the fine, then he gets...
Then he owes it. No, then he owes it.
Wait, I don't understand, because we say, Oinish shigarish im Yisrael hu maxir eno loika. So then we say, in the same pasuk, in Yisrael who Maxir.
He says like no. Why like this?
Like
that's you have to put your commas right. That says Tanya. We're in the Brisa. The Brisa read it like this. The Brisa says only Shagiris Yisrael who Maxir ve'eno loka. Im koinu loka ve'eno Maxir. Period. That's the end of the Brisa.
Right.
Now let's quote that. Im Yisrael who Maxir ve'eno loka. That's the quote from the Brisa.
Oh, okay.
Amai. Why is that true? Lo saseh shekan wase. It's a case of lo saseh, which is before the aseh. Who velilki, and he should get Makkos. So Amar Ula says. Lo yomar lo siya leisha be'ones. I don't need the pasuk that says that he should stay married to this woman in the case of rape. Veligmar mi motzi shemra, because I would be able to learn it out from the case of motzi shemra. Uma motzi shemra shelo asa ma'isa. When it comes to motzi shemra, it's a much less avera because he didn't do any illegal act. He only spoke badly about somebody. And doing something is worse than speaking about something.
Speaking bad about someone, is that considered like Lashon Hara?
It's considered Motzi Shemra. And it's a bad thing to do. Nevertheless, right, we would see what's worse is actually committing an ones. So Amar Rachmana, the pasuk says, V'lo siyeh isha. The pasuk tells us by Motzi Shemra, he has to be married to her forever. Ones lo kol shekain. So then I already have a kal v'chomer to the case of ones, of rape, that he has to stay married to her. I don't need the pasuk.
Right. But you can't give Malchus anyways from Motzi Shemra, right? Can you?
Yeah, Motzi Shemra gets Malchus, Mammon and Malchus. That's the unique one, right?
But again, it's not a Maisa. We said before.
Yes, it's also the unique one, right?
You brought that up, actually. There was a That's right. I remember.
That we had that before, right?
We had it, that there was...
And that's going to be our problem. We're going to learn that right now. Right. Now, the thing is, im eno in lefanov, so if the pasuk is now extra, then that means that this positive commandment isn't intended to tell me that there's a positive commandment to marry her beforehand, because I already know that I'm supposed to marry her for the Motzi Shemra. So why does it tell me to marry her? To make it a lav hanitik la'aseh. Now the pasuk is telling me, for sure you have to marry her. Why? Because Motzi Shemra, you have to marry her. But even if you divorce her, now you have to fix that by marrying her again. Now it becomes a lav hanitik la'aseh. That's why there's no Malchus. That is the Tanihu Inyan La'acharov. It's to tell me that I'm going to tell this statement of Lo Tia Leisha. Lo Tia Leisha is telling me afterwards, She'im Giresh, if he does the Avera of divorcing the woman, Yachzir, he has to marry her again. So, therefore, it is in fact a Lav Hanitik La'aseh. That answers Rabbi Yochanan's problem, and everything is in great shape. However, the problem with that is that in order for that to work, you have to be able to learn a kal v'chomer from Motzi Shemra over to ones. Problem is, Motzi Shemra is about the most unique avera that you can possibly have, right? As Brian is already bothered by Motzi Shemra because it's Mammon and Malchus. You get money, you have to pay, and you get Malchus. Also, it's a mitzvah it's an avera that has no action, and you get Malchus for it. It's got a lot of very uniques. Vakasi oni Motzi Shemra lo gamar.
Sometimes words could be worse than actions.
No. They shouldn't be. Well, here it is, but it shouldn't be, right? Actions are worse than words, right? Sticks and stones will break my bones, as I say. But I cannot learn that kal v'chomer. Why? I can ask the following question. You get 2 punishments by motzi shemra. That is never the case by anything else. It shows me that motzi shemra is a very unique thing, and I cannot learn ones from it. Ella lo yomar lo tia lish b'motzi shemra. Rather, I'll go the other way. Okay, fine. I'm not going to go that way. Let's say then that means that ones is the less severe one, and motzi shemra is the more severe one, and the ligmar me ones. So the fact that it says that by ones, by the rape, that he has to stay married, I'll say kal v'chomer for sure he has to stay married by motzi shemra. Have it your way. Motzi shemra is unique. It's got special things. Fine. That makes it more severe. That means that it's you don't need the pasuk of that he has to stay married to her by the motzi shemra. Ma onesh eno loka mishalem. If when it comes to rape, that there is no double punishment of getting lashes and paying. Amarachman velosi elisha. Nevertheless, he has to stay married to her motzi shemra lo kol shekain. The motzi shemra, which is so much more severe that you get double punishment for it. Then of course you have to stay married. V'lama nemar. So why does it repeat it? Why is the affair repeated over there? Well, if it doesn't help me at all by being in motzi shemra, we'll apply the concept of imeno inyan. We'll take that lo sia leisha and we will apply it back to the ones case. To inyan le ones, we're going to put it over to ones. So therefore, and also an ones, imeno inyan lefanav, it doesn't need to tell me that I have to marry her before I was ever married, because the pasuk says you have to marry her. So therefore, to inyan lacharav, this now pasuk is going to tell me that if I actually divorced her, then I have to get remarried, and that makes it a lav hanitikla asay again. So that's how we're going to say it's a lav hanitikla asay. Problem is, kal v'chomer the other. This time this relies on the kal v'chomer going the other way. That ones is the less severe, and the motzi shemra is the more severe. That doesn't work either. Motzi shemra me ones nami lo gomer. You can't learn the kal v'chomer the other way either. Why? Dekla meifrach. I'll show you why. Because you have to be able to ask the question. Mala ones shekain asay maseh. When it comes to ones, there's an action, and actions speak louder than words. Ella lo yomar lo tia leisha b'motzi shemra. So therefore I can't learn from either one. So therefore, of course, I need the pasuk in both places to tell me that he has to stay married. So none of them is extra. Okay, we'll try one more time. Rather, the fact pasuk bless you. Ella lo yomar lo tia leisha. You shouldn't say that you need the pasuk of lo tia b'motzi shemra. You don't need the pasuk in motzi shemra to tell me that he has to stay married. Sharei ishto because he's already married. Pasuk doesn't have to tell me be married because he's already married. Lama nemar. So why does it tell me to be married?
Maybe because it was in a proper marriage.
No, it's 100% proper marriage, right? That's all. 100% proper marriage. The pasuk doesn't have to tell me to be married. So imeno inyan lemotzi shemra. If it's not necessary for motzi shemra to new inyan laones, then I'm going to move that extra pasuk and I'm put it over by the rape case where they're not married yet. But it already says it over there by ones. So therefore, it becomes an eno inyan lefanov. I don't need the pasuk to tell me that if you're not married, and then you have to get married, because pasuk already says that to new inyan lacharav. So therefore, I'm going to say afterwards that if he does the avera and he divorces her, now we have a lava nitzikla, he has to marry her again. So, however, problem with that is the ema im eno inyan lefanov demotzi shemra to new inyan lacharav d-day. Delo lucky. He says, but wait a second though. Then if the whole point is you're going to say velotia leisha is going to go back and it's going to tell me that it's a lavanitic lase, why are you moving it over from the case of motzi shemra and putting it onto the ones case? Just leave it where it is in motzi shemra and say that it's a lavanitic lase by motzi shemra, meaning that you're already married. I get that. But what if you get divorced and you're motzi shemra? Do I get Makkos for that? The answer is lo tia leisha, marry her again. Therefore, I don't get Makkos. Not by the case of ones, of rape, but by the case of motzi shemra. It becomes a lavanitic by motzi shemra. So fine. By motzi shemra, if he divorces the woman, he doesn't get Makkos because it's lavanitic. But by ones, there's no lavanitic because the requirement to marry her applies whether you divorced her, whether you married her in the first place, whether you divorced her or you didn't divorce her. You have to marry her. So inachinami. So you're right. We're stuck. We can't. We're stuck by the ones case. Okay, we cannot figure out why there shouldn't be Makkos by the ones case. That's basically where we are, because the ones just says that if person commits this avera, so then he must marry her. That has nothing to do with doing any subsequent avera of divorcing her. Then it says you divorce her. Why should you not get Makkos for the divorce? The asay precedes the los asay. So therefore, v'asi ones v'gamar minei. So the answer is, okay, inachinami, I'll give it to you. You just proved to me that by motzi shemra, it's a lav hanitik la'aseh, right? That's what we just proved. By motzi shemra, there's going to be no malchus, because if you do, because it says he should be a wife, they should remain married, but they're already married. The answer is that if you divorce her, you have to marry her again.
How about if he doesn't remarry her? Maybe that's when you get the.
We're going to get there, but
that's what I would assume. Like the
problem is the problem is
it's like Hasra.
We're going to see where the problem with that is, but hang on to that. We're going to now say that if what we've accomplished is we've at least proven that motzi shemra is a lav hanitik la'aseh. Motzi shemra is if you divorce or marry her again. Okay, fine. If that's the case by motzi shemra, that's fine. But now that I learned by motzi shemra, I should be able to apply what's called a mametzinu. This is the rule by all of these cases where you have to marry a woman, you have to stay married her, and it's a lav hanitik la'aseh. If you divorce her, you have to remarry her. Therefore, also by ones, by rape, that should be the same rule. So the problem is going to be my gamar minei. How can you learn? What's the connection between motzi shemra and ones? What? If you're going to try a kal v'chomer, so ibe mamatzinu. Or you can learn it from a mematzinu ikal mefrach. You can ask the questions we already asked. That by motzi shemra they didn't do an action. It's a completely different type of avera. You can't learn from one from the other. Ella amarava. So Rava says instead, kol yamav be'amod v'hachzer. He says, you know why there's no malchus for the divorce? Because there's a requirement to marry her at any subsequent point. How are you going to give him malchus? Then he could fix the problem at any time by marrying her again. If they're married, there's no malchus.
What if he did something to her to force him to divorce him?
Oh, okay, good question. It's a good question. That's a great question, right? What happens if he somehow makes it so that he can't remarry her? Then we'll have a question. So that's the exact point that we're going to be talking about.
She could make it that he can remarry, right?
That's going to be another point to it. So hang on, we're all asking all the right questions.
No, but it's right. It's right what we said.
But these are all the questions that we're asking. So the point is, why is it? You're right. It's not a lav hanitik la'aseh, but technically speaking, we have a problem and a challenge, right? Because since he can just remarry her, so then there's no point at which you could be chayav malchus for it. We're going to say why, but I'll give it away. The basic bottom line is this: where's the avera? The avera is the divorce.
Mm.
Okay, so does that mean that how are you going to? You need, in order to get malchus, you need hasra. You need a warning. So then, how are you giving this warning? The warning is that you cannot remain unmarried to her. Well, how do you know I'm going to remain unmarried? You don't know that. It's hasra safek.
So after he's dead, you pull him up.
Oh, so then it's too late. Right?
Maybe tell her I want to get back with you. She says, whatever you did to me, I don't want to get back.
So these are all we've now raised all of the issues of the next page of the Gemara to be able. Now we got to sort them all out. All of these issues, right? The hasra safek issue we've got to deal with. We've got to deal with nullifying and making it so that you can never marry the woman again. We've got to deal with what was the other one that we had mentioned. Anyway, well, all of these issues are now the next page.
But the hasra probably comes after the rape, meaning he has to marry her. So there, you give him hasra then. So
hasra on the lo saseh. Where's the lo saseh that you shall not be divorced?
Isn't it that you must continue to be married with that? But you're saying that's not lo saseh. That's not the
coming up.
Yeah.
Hang on. Now we've got all the questions. Yeah, it's all we've asked all the questions. They're all floating around in there, and everything seems a little bit jumbled. So let's put them all into order here. Okay. V'chein similarly. Ki also Rabin Amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Rabin came from Eretz Yisrael, said Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Yamav ve'amud behachzer. You have your eternity. You have all the time in the world to fix this problem and get married again. Okay. Amalei Rav Papa the Rava. So Rav Papa says to Rava, before we get into any of these other issues we raised, there is one other issue that we have to point out, and that is the reason why potentially there's no malchus by ones is a very simple one, right? V'hal lo dami lave lelav dechasima. All the prototype for malchus of Eros is don't muzzle your animal. And this lo saseh of don't be divorced from this wife, and you must remarry her, is not equivalent to the prototype. Why? Because there's a positive commandment before the negative commandment, and that's not the case by the circumstance of muzzling. So therefore, that by itself should make it so that you should not get Makkos. So he says, don't worry about that. We're going to quickly put that problem off. He says, I don't understand. Because the Torah gives you a separate positive command beforehand, that makes the prohibition any less? In other words, the prohibition is in isolation, separate from the positive commandment. There was a positive commandment to be married, but there's a lo saseh now about separating from her. So that negative commandment is what we're looking at. That other positive commandment is irrelevant and not connected really to the lo saseh. So he says, Ihachi. He says, if that's how you're going to look at it, so lav shenitak la'aseh nami. How are you looking at the concept of lav shenitak la'aseh, the prohibition which has a positive commandment afterwards, which we for sure agreed you don't get Makkos, because we for sure agreed that wasn't similar to the case of the muzzling. So how are you going to look at that one? Nami, lema mishum dekasev be'rachmana aseh yasera migaragara. You're going to say, what? Just because there's an extra positive commandment afterwards, it makes the negative commandment any less? So he says, Amar le, ahulinituke lav huda also. That's the whole point of alav anitikase, is that the positive commandment afterwards comes to repair the avera of the lo saseh.
Right.
That's why those two are connected. That's not the case by when the positive commandment has nothing to do, is separate and disconnected from the lo saseh. So that issue was resolved and dealt with. Now let's deal with some of our issues that we've been dealing with. Hani chalaman damar bitlu velo bitlu.
Interesting.
Let's explain this. We're going to have a brisa. This was very complicated because the Gemara, you need to know the next page is Gemara in order to understand this little section right here. But this page of Gemara has a brisa. Brisa says like this. When do you get Makkos, right? And there's a disagreement on how to read the brisa. Either I can read the brisa, I can say that the brisa says that I get Makkos when I have an obligation, if I have this lo saseh to do, if I committed a lo saseh and I have a positive commandment to fix it, do I get the Makkos at the point at which I violated the lo saseh? And the only reason I don't get the aseh is because we basically give the guy a choice, do the aseh or you'll get your Makkos. But the avera happened, so you're chayav Makkos, but then you can replace your Makkos with your positive commandment. Or do we say, you're never chayav Makkos until it's impossible for you to fix the mistake. So you have to what's called nullify the positive commandment. And if you nullify the positive commandment, then you can get Makkos. Right? So here's how that works.
Well, if you're nullifying the positive commandment, why are you getting Makkos? You're nullifying it. It means...
Well, you're nullifying the fix. You're nullifying the positive commandment. Right? By not, like the case that you said. Here's this woman that I have to remarry. I can fix my problem by remarrying her. But let's say I come up with a circumstance in which I am unable to remarry her.
You think you did to her
that point, right? That point, at which point, now that I created a circumstance where I'm unable to remarry her, maybe at that point I have violated the lo saseh and I can get Makkos for it. Okay? So now, according to this position, right, we are basically establishing that this is a circumstance, this goes according to the opinion that says bitlu v'lo bitlu. In order to violate this prohibition, right, we said that the reason why he doesn't get Makkos is because he can always remarry her at some future point. Well, that's fine according to the opinion that says you cannot get Makkos until you've already nullified any possibility of fixing this. Right? But what about the other opinion? The other opinion says, as soon as you did the divorce, you're chayav Makkos. And basically we come to you and we give you the choice. Either we're going to give you Makkos right now, or remarry her.
But did you receive, you get a divorce, you don't get Makkos before?
We said that yes, that's what we came out with. So the question is, why should that be? Why should that be? If this is if we're looking at this from a perspective of that the avera happens and you're chayav Makkos, regardless of whether you can fix it or not, it's that you have to fix it, otherwise you are chayav Makkos. Then how are you going to explain why he's not getting Makkos right now for sitting here for 20 years not remarrying her? So the answer is because midi hu taima el Rabbi Yochanan. Remember, this whole argument, this whole conversation started with what does Rabbi Yochanan say? This was all Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, right? And Rabbi Yochanan is the one who says bittul. Rabbi Yochanan is the opinion that actually says, and it comes out nice and convenient, Rabbi Yochanan is the one who says that you don't get Makkos unless you completely nullify the ability to fix it. So therefore, since this person can be not married to her for 20 years, but he can be, so as long as he can be, he can't get Makkos for it. That is Rabbi Yochanan's position constantly, as we're going to see in a moment. Here we go.
How about the camp? There was something else I want to ask you about leaving the camp. I was looking for it, and I couldn't find it. Where if you leave the camp or you get him...
Yes, right? You have somebody who becomes Tamei, and then you must leave the camp.
So how would you give a hasra for that?
Hang on to the hasra issue, because we're going to deal with the hasra issue next. Let's deal with the issue of kimu v'lo kimu, and then bitlu v'lo bitlu first. Then we'll deal with the issue of hasra, okay? Because that's going to tie into it, okay? So, ha time el Rabbi Yochanan, ha'amar le Rabbi Yochanan letana, right? Because Rabbi Yochanan explained the Brayso says to me, you have to teach it bitlu chayev v'lo bitlu pater. If you nullify your ability to fix the avera, then you're chayev malchus. But if you don't, and even though you don't fix it, the problem, you don't do the positive thing, but you still have the ability, you don't get malchus. Detani, here's the Brayso that we were talking about, and here's how we deal with it. Tana Kama Rabbi Yochanan. They taught the following in front of Rabbi Yochanan. Kol mitzvahs lo saseh sheyesh ba kum aseh. Anytime you have a prohibition and you have a positive commandment afterwards that can fix it. Kiyam aseh sheba. If you fulfill the positive commandment in it, pater. Then you are exempt from malchus. Bittul aseh sheba. If you make it so that it's impossible for you to fulfill that positive commandment afterwards, now you're chayev malchus. So, Amar Le, Rabbi Yochanan says, my kamart. This Brayso is impossible to understand because Kiyam Pater, if you're going to say that you'd be exempt from Malchus if you do the fix, so then when would you be liable for Malchus? Lo Kiyam, you'd be chayev. Then you'd be chayev for Malchus immediately at the point at which you don't do the positive thing. Even if you could still do it in the future, the fact that you didn't do it right now makes you chayev malchus.
But he did the positive thing. He married her.
No, you're ahead of us again. No, we're saying he's here. He's sitting here, and they're divorced, and the Beis Din says to him, "You got to be married," and he says, "Okay, great, I will."
Right,
and they walk out the door. Is he chayev malchus or not? He's not married right now.
But he fulfilled the mitzvah essay when he married her after Oinus.
And then he did the lo saseh afterwards when he divorced her. And now the question is, shouldn't he get malchus for the lo saseh? And the answer is, according to the opinion that says that he still can do it, that the fact that he doesn't do it means he's exempt. When he does the avera, he's exempt. That means if he doesn't do it, then he's chayev malchus. Then the guy says, "Okay, I'll get married," and walks out the door. You should give him malchus.
Right.
But bitel chayev lo bitel pater. And if you're going to say that it is a nullification that's required, when he walks out the door, he goes, "Sure, I'll do it," and then he walks out the door. So the fact of the matter is, he could always do it tomorrow, or the next day, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, right? Then he doesn't get malchus until he does something that makes it impossible for him to marry her again.
Can't the Beis Din put a time limit on something?
No.
Why?
Because the Torah doesn't. Torah doesn't say, basically could tell you, yes, well, you'll be over a violation to Rabban and we'll give you Malchus Mardus if you don't marry her within the next year. That's nice. But the question is, when are you chayev these Malchus Midoraisa? That's the question. Okay, so the answer is, he says, Tani bitlu v'lo bitlu. Rabbi Yochanan's perspective is that it has to be, you're not liable for Malchus as long as you have the capacity to fix it. Even if you don't fix it, you have the capacity to fix it. You're chayev Malchus at the point at which you ruin your ability to fix it. For Rabbi Shimon Lakish Amar, Rabbi Shimon Lakish says, no. Kimu v'lo kaimu. You have to have the ability and not do it immediately. You're chayev Malchus. So basically, Beis Din says, great, you're going to marry her. We're going to bring the whip tomorrow. And if you're not married, there's going to be trouble. Okay? That's how Reish Lakish says it. But my kamiflagi, what is the point of argument? The hasra safek. The argument now is the hasra issue. Right. Because, kamiflagi, marsav hasra safek shema hasra. One says, how can I give malchus? The guy gets, the person gets divorced, right? So one opinion says hasra safek.
Already done it.
Right? That Rabbi Yochanan holds Hasra Safek is fine. Hasra Safek is fine. I can give you Malchus for Hasra Safek. Right? So, because The hasra that I warned the guy when he was getting divorced, I said, don't get divorced because you can get Makkos. Well, then the whole reason why are you not getting Makkos? The answer is because of you never nullified it. Reish Lakish is going to take a look at it and he's going to say, I gave you hasra, and now the hasra, why the hasra suffix is
But he didn't give the hasra before he did the maisa. He didn't give the hasra before he did the maisa. The maisa is done. You're now saying unless you fix it.
No, one
but
second.
that's not the
What's the losa say? The divorce.
The divorce.
Right.
He's
So
divorced.
therefore, when according to Reish Lakish, he says don't divorce her or you're chayiv malchus, that is true.
Right, that's before. That's
Because
when he
Reish
gets
Lakish
married.
says
Right.
you are chayiv malchus,
Right.
and now we're going to take the whip and beat you up. And he says, but I'll do it tomorrow. And you say, I don't care. I'm beating you up right now because you're in violation of the losa say.
Right, that's if the hasra.
That's
was
how Reish
before.
Lakish looks at
Right,
it.
Before he got
Same
married.
hasra
Right.
before the divorce, not the marriage. The divorce. The losa is the divorce.
Oh, so he got hasra before he got divorced.
That's right.
Okay.
They say to him, "Don't get it." But Rabbi Yochanan will say that hasra doesn't do any good because he'd come and tell him, "Don't get divorced or you get malchus." Who says? Maybe in 15 years we'll get remarried and then I'll be not chayav malchus for it. It'll be fine. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are going according to their old argument about whether hasra suffix works or it doesn't work. As we said, let's say somebody says, I'm going to take an oath. I'm going to eat this loaf of bread today. The day goes by, he does not eat it. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, Damari Tarvayu, Eino Loka. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish both agree there's no malchus for that. Why? Rabbi Yochanan Omer Eino Loka. Rabbi Yochanan says, I'll tell you why you don't get malchus. Says Tezayin Amad Aleph Mishum Dahavi Lav Shein Bo Maisa. There's no action. You didn't eat the loaf of bread. So therefore, without eating the loaf of bread, there's no action. V'chol Lav Shein Bo Maisa Ein Loka Lav. You can't get malchus for not doing something. Reish Lakish Amar Eino Loka. Reish Lakish says, no, the action was your false oath, your bad oath. Eino Loka Mishum Dahavi Hasra Safek. Okay, well, when did you get the warning then? You got the warning when you took the oath. Don't take that oath because if you violate that oath, you're going to get malchus. Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan says that's not a warning because who says I'm going to violate the oath? Rabbi Yochanan says it's hasra suffix. You're right. Who says I'm going to violate the oath? But that's where the avera is. Hasra suffix is valid. That's a valid warning.
Can't someone say, had I known? That's the whole point of had I known.
That's going to be a question about whether you can retroactively invalidate the oath.
Right.
However, we're talking about the oath is fine.
Yeah.
So therefore, v'chol hasra suffix lo shma asra. Okay, we're going to stop here, but we will pick up